resignation letter, and we have Sajid Javid, who has resigned as Health Secretary, which I guess means he's ever going to come on this show, as we've been trying to get for a couple of weeks now. We are live covering all the developments. See, the big one is whether this is finally of Boris Johnson. Houdini, he's gotten out of scrapes that are as bad as any scrapes you can get into. He has delivered himself of a zillion gaffes, any one of which would have taken out a conventional political figure, but he seemed to reason that in the Boris Johnson model, that if you made a bazillion gaffes, they all tended to fade away into insignificance. This is slightly different. This is not backbenchers from the backbenchers. This has the organised cabinet coup against the Prime Minister, and that makes him more vulnerable. These are guys, to use Lyndon Johnson's expression, who are inside the tent urinating out rather than inside the tent urinating in. And we're going to try and break it down for you, what it actually means. I said yesterday that this fellow nobody had ever heard of, the Deputy Chief Whip, who'd been groping lads at the Carlton Club, was a fella of no consequence. But for some reason, the groped bottoms at the Carlton Club seem to have been a derriere too far for at least two cabinets. We are going to come back and talk about that with Toby Young, with Laura Perrins, with Baroness Hoey, who was from the other side, enjoyed working with Boris on one thing and another. We're going to come straight back and break the headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
Good evening. Sorry to disappoint. Not Polly here. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson's facing the biggest challenge to his leadership after Chancellor Rishi Sunak and the Health Secretary Sajid Javid resigned from the government. Boris Johnson's close allies both resigned in the wake of the Chris Pincher scandal. Their announcements came minutes after the Prime Minister apologised for hiring the MP as Deputy Chief Tory Whip, despite being made aware of complaints against him. Sajid Javid was the first to resign, posting his resignation letter to Boris Johnson online. It says the country needs a strong and principled Conservative Party, and the party is bigger than any one individual. I served you loyally and as a friend, but we all serve the country first. When made to choose between those loyalties, there can only be one answer.
Hello, Mr. Javid. How do ITV?
Hello.
How do you feel about
Good evening.
your
I'm just going to go and spend some time with my family. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Later, as he returned home, the former Health
evening.
Secretary refused to answer any questions to reporters. Well, Rishi Sunak resigned just minutes after his former cabinet colleague. In his resignation letter, he told Boris Johnson the public rightly expect government to be conducted properly, competently and seriously. I recognise this may be my last ministerial job, but I believe these standards are worth fighting for, and that is why I am resigning. Well, earlier, the Prime Minister apologised for appointing Chris Pincher to Deputy Chief Tory Whip, despite being made aware of complaints against him. Boris Johnson says if he had his time again, he would not have given him the job.
Prime Minister, do you accept it was a grave error to appoint Chris Pincher to your government?
Yes, I think it was a mistake, and I apologise for it. I think in hindsight it was the wrong thing to do. I apologise to everybody who's been badly affected by it, and I just want to make absolutely clear that there's no place in this government for anybody who is predatory or who abuses their position of power.
Did you want to joke, though, Pincher by name, Pincher by nature?
Well, what I can tell you is that if I look at the background of this and why I regret it so much, is that about 3 years ago, there was a complaint made against Chris Pincher in the Foreign Office. The complaint was cleared up. He apologised. It was raised with me. orally I was briefed on what had happened, and if I had my time again, I would think back on it and recognise that he wasn't going to learn any lesson, and he wasn't going to change.
I know that you didn't deny using that
that
phrase there. Prime Minister, this is about truth, isn't it? It's about whether people can believe what you say. And we now know that those who speak for you over the last few days have said things that turned out to be untrue. Did you lie to them?
No, and let me explain what happened. So this is we're talking about a series of events or a series of appointments over several years. So Chris Pincher came into government as Deputy Chief Whip before I became Prime Minister. He was moved to the Foreign Office. He then went on to be a Minister for Housing.
Indeed.
And we then moved him back to be Deputy Chief Whip. As I say, about 2.5 years ago, I got this complaint. It was something that was only raised with me very cursorily, but I wish that we had, I in particular, had acted on it, and that he had not continued in government, because he then went on, I'm afraid, to behave, as far as we can see, according to the allegations that we have, very, very badly.
I'm conscious our time is limited.
I'm sorry for those who've been badly affected by it.
Well, a number of senior Tories have come out in support of the Prime Minister. Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries says she's 100% behind Boris Johnson, describing him as the Prime Minister who consistently gets all the big decisions right. Meanwhile, Brexit Opportunities Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg said business would go on as usual, as Boris Johnson still has a job to do. This is a developing story, and we'll have more on those supports a little later. Well, the resignations come just weeks after a damaging confidence vote, which saw 41% of his own MPs withdraw their support. That was followed by disappointing by-election defeats in Tiverton and Honiton and Wakefield, triggering the resignation of party chairman Oliver Dowden. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says this is the end of Boris Johnson's government.
After all the sleaze and all the failure, it's clear that this Tory government is now collapsing. And Tory cabinet ministers have been cheerleaders for Johnson throughout this sorry saga. They backed him when he broke the law. They backed him when he lied. They backed him when he mocked the sacrifices of the British people. So they have been complicit as he has disgraced his office and let down his country. And frankly, if they had a shred of integrity, they would have gone months ago.
And of course, we'll have all the latest on this developing story throughout the evening. We're TV, we're online, and we're DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Mark.
The Mark Steyn Show, live from Westminster on a busy news night with the resignation of 2 cabinet ministers. I was just listening to Boris on the news there, professing to be appalled by Mr. Pincher's behaviour. He, as you know, he's resigned for groping fellas in the Carlton Club. But I couldn't help remembering Boris in one of his Churchill books, where he particularly enjoyed Sir Winston's reaction to some Tory going at it with a guardsman in the shrubbery of one of the royal parks. And as Sir Winston said approvingly, makes you proud to be British. And I can't help but feel that that actually is Boris Johnson's honest reaction to the behaviour of chaps like Pincher. Let us go to one of the members of the Conservative Party backbenches. Graham Stringer MP is outside Parliament. Everybody's been predicting, this is the fall of, I beg your pardon, Labour MP. Everybody's been predicting this is the fall of Boris Johnson. That is the fall of Boris Johnson. He survives, he survives, he survives. Does he survive this?
He may survive for a day or two, but I think this is the end of this government and we're heading for a new Prime Minister and a general election. I've been listening to sort of loyal Conservative backbenchers saying he's the best person for the job. It's a pretty absurd position to take, to say that a man who is a regular liar, a congenital liar, is the best person to lead this country. He is not. He has continually failed the country, both in the services that are being provided by the government and in his own integrity and honesty. And the sooner we get rid of him, the sooner we have the general election, so that the people can decide on a new government, the better.
But Boris Johnson's been who he is for decades now. You say he's a congenital liar. If that's true, he's been basically the same congenital lying Boris Johnson his entire adult life, more or less. The Tory party did a deal. They wanted the congenital liar, as you call him, to put Brexit through, and they figured he was the only one who can do it. What's changed?
Well, I think he did two things. One, he won a general election with a big majority and then got Brexit done, more or less, or about 95% of Brexit done. And I think the electorate thought he was a refreshing change from people who thought it was more boring. He tells a good joke, but the joke's worn thin. And people realise that we need a government in this country that is serious about delivering the priorities, whether it's dealing with the cost of living crisis that we're going through, or whether it's dealing with international affairs, or the appalling quality of service we're getting right across the board at the present time. We've got 6 police forces in special measures. One can go on and on. This government simply isn't governing or administering this country properly. So I think that joke's worn thin, and he is the same Boris Johnson, but people have had enough of him.
Do you think he'll be gone by the end of the week then?
I wouldn't know how quickly the Conservatives will get rid of him, but it will be fairly quickly. I've very little doubt that a majority of Conservative MPs now have had enough and want him to go. There were some Conservative MPs in the privacy of the bars and coffee rooms who were more or less doing a jig when they heard that cabinet ministers were resigning. That's the atmosphere in part of the Conservative Party. There are some people who are loyal because they think it's right to stand by their man, but they're a diminishing number, and most of them recognise that the game's up.
That's a very interesting view from the Labour benches. Thank you very much, Graham Stringer, speaking to us from Parliament. I have known Boris Johnson, it's got to be 30-something years now, but one of the chaps who knows him rather longer than that, goes all the way back to Oxford with him, is Toby Young, the founder of the Daily Sceptic and the founder of the Free Speech Union. You had a rather cynical tweet channeling Casablanca half an hour back.
Yeah, I called it the Captain Renault coup, because famously in Casablanca, Captain Renault claims to be shocked that gambling is taking place at Rick's place, and rounds up the usual suspects. And it was slightly, when Sajid and Rishi Sunak in their resignation letters, they expressed kind of almost shock to discover that Boris Johnson wasn't a man of moral probity and good character that they'd been led to believe. So now they'd been forced to resign. Seemed a little bit sort of like an implausible explanation.
Yes, because this has happened. They put up with so much. Why do you think whatever it was that was the final straw was the final straw?
I don't think it's an organised coup. And my reason for saying that is that most other cabinet ministers have said on Twitter tonight that Boris has their full support. They're not intending to resign. If it was an organised coup, you'd expect some other cabinet ministers to have resigned. I suspect that what's happened is that Sajid got wind of the fact that Rishi was intending to resign. Sajid wants to be a candidate in what he thinks will be the forthcoming leadership election alongside Rishi, and therefore he thought, well, I'm going to have to resign too if I'm going to compete with Rishi in the forthcoming leadership election. And I don't think there's much love lost between them. I don't think Rishi has much love for I don't think Sajid has much love for Rishi, because Rishi's now doing the job that Sajid did under Theresa May, and Sajid probably thinks, if I was Chancellor now, I'd be in pole position. Life's not been fair to me. So I don't think they've conspired. I think Sajid got wind of Rishi's resignation and decided, well, in order to shore up my credentials as a potential successor, I need to resign too. But that doesn't look like there's anyone else about to resign.
Does Boris Johnson survive this?
Well, it's an entirely open question. It's very hard to predict. Boris's superpower is his ability to survive scandals. If he was a mortal politician, I think this would be a death blow. In the same way that Geoffrey Howe's resignation as Foreign Secretary was more or less a death blow to Margaret Thatcher. So much, as you said earlier, people's reservations about Boris are sort of priced in. It's not a great shock that he may have known about Chris Pincher's history as a sex pest before it came to light. People sort of accept that that's just Boris, and I think people will think, well, they'll be trying to make up their minds like we are. Is Boris going to survive? If they think that he isn't, then that'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if they think that he is, then maybe he will. Well,
two things here. The first is that Boris, the joke has worn off, as Mr. Stringer was saying. And we are seeing here, so Boris Johnson is now arriving back at number 10, as you can see, and the surly types of Fleet Street are you going to resign, Prime Minister? Let's put that aside, because it's less interesting to me in a strange way as Boris's sense of humour. I think he's lost his sense of humour. I think he lost it at that, whatever he's called, the Peppa Pig speech, where he was doing jokes about the children's character Peppa Pig to an audience of middle-aged businessmen who hadn't heard of the character, and they all died. And Boris had his Ceausescu moment. I mean, Ceausescu wasn't a barrel of laughs, but it was in the sense that Boris, the ashen look on his face, that his jokes weren't landing anymore.
Yes.
And then secondly, the tragic element of this is that Boris has schemed and manoeuvred to become Prime Minister for decades, and he got there and he blew it.
Yeah, I think that to me is the really surprising thing. I mean, having known Boris even longer than you. First met him in 1983. And from the very moment I first saw him, it was obvious that he thought of himself as a man of destiny. Part of his charisma is this sense that he is destined for great things. He's focused on that prize. He thinks of himself as a kind of world historical individual that's going to change the world. And he's capable of inspiring others to believe that. Someone with such self-belief kind of can encourage others to believe the same. And all his life, seemingly, has been devoted to securing this prize. I remember trying to advise him when he was editor of The Spectator not to become an MP, try and ride both horses and pursue a political career at the same time. He could easily have been editor of the Daily Telegraph by now had he remained a journalist. But he was determined to take the kind of political route because his eyes were on the prize of Downing Street. And I thought, having aimed at that prize all his life, everything was designed to secure that goal, even from a very early age. His sister, Rachel, recounts how at the age of 5, he wanted to be world king. So he kind of scaled back his ambitions and to focus on becoming Prime Minister. But one would have thought that having kind of decided from the age of 5 that you want to be a kind of world historical political leader, leaving an enormous legacy. You would have thought that when he got to Downing Street, he would have put aside childish things and decided to really focus on the job in hand. He realises he's achieved his dream. Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history and really make a difference, really leave an important legacy. But actually, he doesn't appear to have changed at all since becoming Prime Minister.
No, that's what's kind of incredible, because you say that. I mean, politics attracts that kind of person. Theresa May, who nobody thinks of as a world historical figure, but from Theresa's point of view, she schemed for that #1 job. She did, you know, crummy jobs like chairman of the Tory party, where she berated the Tories as the nasty party, and you thought, this woman is never going to make it to #10, but she just bided her time, seized her moment, and was a completely third-rate figure when she was there. Boris, the difference with Boris, with all his Churchillian comparisons and everything, was that he didn't want to be Theresa May or David Cameron or John Major. He wanted to be a consequential figure. And I can't understand why he sort of bamboozled himself into destroying his own premiership.
Yeah, it's as though one often felt when, observing Boris, even doing kind of juggling half a dozen jobs as kind of motoring correspondent of GQ, columnist for The Telegraph, editor of The Spectator, that even with all those responsibilities, he was slightly bored. There wasn't quite enough to engage his intellect. It was almost as though, he was above really trying, because those things were just too trivial. And it's almost as though he's had to manufacture these crises in order to really focus and get engaged, in order to overcome that kind of natural lassitude and boredom. I mean, it's just bizarre.
Well, that only works if you're actually doing great things, and he had some way. I always say I like this idea when he just randomly threw out that he was thinking of putting a roundabout on the bottom of the Irish Sea, somewhere near the Isle of Man, with exits for Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales. And I at that time I thought, Boris is probably the only guy who could pull off something like that. And then there's the other side, where when I saw him kissing hands with the Queen, or even at the G7 and the Commonwealth Conference recently, you think to yourself, this is ridiculous. He pulled it off, but he's not really up to it.
I mean, I think he has so many good qualities. I mean, of course, we're focusing on all his shortcomings and his character flaws, but he's very bright. He's a fantastic communicator. I think he's got the right instincts in a lot of areas. I backed him on Brexit, and I think he probably is in favour of free speech. He's proud to be British. He's a patriot. He's got a kind of charisma, an ability to communicate that no other politician of his generation has. I mean, you see him in front of an audience. He's got this ability to kind of, he'll be struggling to remain on script, but in a kind of slightly rehearsed theatrical way, and he'll look up under his fringe, almost like the Princess of Wales. And there's a flash of vulnerability. The little boy, the wounded child within, and immediately he makes a connection with his audience in a way that no other politician I've seen can do.
He does. No one would deny that. He does that Nina Simone thing, where he shows up like 28 minutes late, and everyone's just getting really and then somehow he pulls it off. But the Tory party's pact was that they wanted him, they understood all the disadvantages, and the character flaws, but they thought he could get Brexit done, which he sort of did, and then he would govern as a Tory Prime Minister. And he didn't really do that last bit, did he?
No. I mean, the first time I was truly disappointed by him was when he decided, having initially resisted pressure to lock down in March 2020, when he initially resisted, and said, we'll just have to take it on the chin. I thought, that's the guy I voted for. That's the guy I've supported all my life. This is the Prime Minister I hoped Boris would be. He's standing up to the pressure. He's sticking to his guns. He knows that depriving us of our liberty for very uncertain reasons is the wrong thing to do. Well done, Boris. Fantastic. And then he did a reverse ferret.
Yeah.
He U-turned. He caved into the pressure, and I thought, crikey, maybe he isn't the man I was hoping he'd be.
Just quickly on that, Toby, because the comparisons are, he doesn't like the comparisons, but the comparisons are made with Trump. With Trump, the Republicans understood all the character flaws. He basically shagged a porn star, and everybody knows that, and all the rest of it. But Trump took care of the base. Trump on, abortion, for example, he'd been pro-abortion almost as a New York liberal. He'd been pro-abortion all his entire life, but he understood that the base wouldn't go there with him, so he appointed anti-abortion judges and all the rest of it. Boris seems to have done the opposite. He took his base for granted.
Yeah, I mean, I hoped that after the confidence vote, the way he'd reset would be to embrace red meat conservative policies, scrap net zero, lean into the culture war instead of trying to sidestep those issues.
No.
But actually, no, he hasn't. And, just last week he said that had a woman been president of Russia, it was all to do with Putin's toxic masculinity. He thought, crikey, why are you pandering to the woke when you should be galvanising your base? So he doesn't have that kind of core of support.
He was, the difference is, when he was at The Spectator, he was an erratic executive of that magazine, but he was surrounded by people who kind of kept him ideologically on the straight and narrow, and that's changed. Toby Young, thank you very much. As I said, you go back further with him than anybody, and there is a great tract, or maybe an hilarious comic novel to be written about the fall of Boris, if such it is. Let's get to your reaction. Helen says, Sajid Javid resigns. I wonder why. In somewhat related news, our entire COVID hierarchy all ran away in the last month. It's odd. Jason says, Mark, all the high-profile jab pushers seem to be either caught kissing or wriggling their way out of the public eye one way or another. Yeah, the whole thing about the COVID regime is that the people who imposed it upon us didn't believe in it themselves. And that's true whether you're talking about whatever he's called, Professor Pantsdown at Imperial College, and Sajid Javid and all the rest of it. Paul says, why doesn't Theresa May take some responsibility for this fellow pincher? Because Theresa May is barely remembered. That's the difference. Boris Johnson was going to be a consequential Prime Minister, not like Lady May, not like Mr. Cameron, not like John Major. Jonathan says, Mark, the country is better off without Rishi. He was the worst chancellor we ever had. The cost of living crisis, debt, etc. are down to his mismanagement of the economy. He was totally incompetent. He would say that the cost of living crisis is the cost of lockdown. And if you notice in his resignation letter, he was opening up some clear blue water between himself and Boris Johnson, rather in the way that Boris did when he resigned as Foreign Secretary. We are joined by Baroness Hoey, who for much of her time in Parliament was on the other side of the chamber from Boris, but actually had quite cordial relations with Boris Johnson.
Well, that's one way of putting it. Yes, no, I worked for him at City Hall, unpaid, I should say, as the sports commissioner, because he was very keen to get grassroots sport more recognised and to get some legacy from the Olympics. And I worked very, very happily in the City Hall team cross-party. One of the things about Boris when he was mayor, and he still tried to do it when he became Prime Minister, he wasn't really very tribal. And sometimes, that is now perhaps beginning to be part of the problem, because he has appointed lots of people who, if I'd been the Prime Minister having won with 80 majority, I wouldn't have put in the cabinet.
People will wonder about that, won't they? How he could win an 80-seat majority. The comparisons were made with the glory days. I think in terms of the percentage of the vote too, you have to go back to 1970, whatever it was. And it was a spectacular victory. And then what?
Yes, and he won. I think the thing we need to also remember about Boris was he didn't have really lots of support inside Parliament. He didn't spend a lot of time as an MP. He wasn't a kind of collegiate in that way. And then he won the big majority once he'd been elected leader on the basis of, you know, Brexit. And you know, he owes his prime ministership to those Labour voters who turned against the Labour Party because of their policies on the European Union, particularly the second referendum. Rather ironic that now, 6 years later, of course, we've got the leader of the Labour Party saying he will never ever join the European Union again. I wonder would he have said that tomorrow if he'd known what was happening today. But you know, the reality is that Boris, I think if I'm going to be critical of him, it will be not for all these things that are going on about, you know, Partygate and Pinchergate or whatever you want to call it, is because he just hasn't, for me, done what he should have been doing with an 80-seat majority in terms of getting the country really benefiting from leaving the European Union.
Yeah,
I know that's, of course, Theresa May's fault. We know that, but
it is as if he ran as an opportunist Brexiteer.
Yeah, I don't think he was a passionate believer in leaving the European Union like some of us were.
No.
But he did do a brilliant job during the campaign, and there's without a doubt. And I saw it even when he was mayor of London. You know, he has that charisma about him that even going on the tube with him was, you know, like being with royalty. Now, it may not be quite the same, but he still has that knack of being able to reach out, and people who may not like his politics will still like him. You know, people knew when they voted for him a lot of these things about his personal way of behaving.
Well, except I think it's been a little too exposed recently.
Yeah.
I mean, he was naturally funny and charming as mayor, particularly during that Olympic. I remember him telling the guy from the Irish Times, "Don't you think it's good the way we're letting some of you other countries win some of the medals and things?" He had he had a natural way of playing people, and somehow the isolation of Downing Street and the entourage has killed all that in him. It doesn't seem to work anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people probably realise just when you become Prime Minister how much your life then is completely controlled. And even when he was Foreign Secretary, I know that he hated the fact that they wouldn't let him walk from Downing Street when he was coming in, you know, to where he was living and that kind of thing. And of course, he used to ride his bicycle. Right, we're talking as if he's no longer there. The reality is, you know, I don't bet on him just disappearing.
No, we are getting a bit premature in writing the obituaries, but there are early signs of the premiers of the dependent territories, the whatever they're called now, the overseas crown colonies, as we used to say, in the Turks and Caicos and elsewhere. They were some of the most critical of him as an executive running a department, particularly after whatever hurricane it was swept through the British West Indies. Nobody really paid any attention to the warning signs about his defects as an executive, did they?
He needs really good people around him. He needs people who are prepared to say to him, "That's nonsense, Boris, you can't do that." You know, and he did have that team at City Hall. There was no doubt about it. Part of his success was he managed to get people around him who told him the truth, and he would tend to listen to that. And I think, you know, I think he did change a bit after his illness when he was in the hospital just up the road, you know, and I think he did. And then, well, I mean, we better not go into other things that happened to him that may have affected his behaviour.
No.
But all I'm concerned about now, if I have to say, is that that he sticks to. We've got to get the protocol bill through,
right.
And I'm worried about who might, if he goes. And as I say, I don't actually think he will go in the immediate future. I may be completely wrong. Who would replace him? And I don't have anyone that I can think of right away as.
You've been in opposition for the wilderness years, and then you've seen your party come roaring back. There are natural cycles to these things. The Tories from 79 to 97, the Labour from 97 to 2010. We're kind of due for that swing. But where I think people feel aggrieved is that there's nothing conservative to show for the Cameron, May, Johnson years, except for Brexit, and that was done by Nigel Farage far more than it owes to any of those Tory prime ministers.
Yeah, we wouldn't have got a referendum without Brexit, without the Brexit Party, and without and it is disappointing. I mean, that could have been his real memoir, you know, what achieving and seeing some of the good things that could come out of Brexit. I mean, economically, to me, that wasn't the most important issue about leaving. It was about constitutionally getting our own country to be completely, you know, democratic, that we control things. So I suppose, you know, Brexit didn't mean we were always going to have good governments, or that the Conservative government was always going to be the best government. And there's no doubt about it, people do get fed up after a period of time of any government looking like they are, you know, being not listening. And that's what we've seen, I think, recently.
What does he believe in? I remember, I think Boris was going on Question Time that night, and we had a rather bibulous lunch beforehand at which he felt he didn't have enough sound bites and talking points, so he asked me what I thought he should say, and I went to, there were things he wasn't interested in, so in a way I know what he doesn't believe in, but actually he wasn't interested in social conservatism, oddly enough, which may be what has done for him with guys like Pincher, who obviously he shouldn't have revitalised. But what do you? As I said, I can tell you things he doesn't go for. But what does he believe in?
Well, I think that is probably going to be his next book when he eventually finishes being Prime Minister. I mean, I don't think anyone can really say that he has passions that he wanted to execute in government, to do things that really would make a difference to people. And he seems to have changed. I mean, when he was at City Hall, I didn't hear much talk about green issues and net zero and sort of, you know, hugging little animals and all of that kind of thing. That wasn't something that seemed to be to the fore, and that's one of the things that I think he's changed quite a bit, and I'm not quite sure who's influencing him there.
What do you think of the? I mean, in the end, people like Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid are only really interesting.
Yeah. Neither of them will be Prime Minister.
Okay, excellent.
Neither of them will be Prime Minister.
You've saved us all the trouble of pretending to take that seriously, Kate.
Neither will be.
No, I'm inclined to agree with you. Is there anyone who could actually extend the Tory cycle and win the next election if it isn't Boris?
If probably there will be someone who might come in as an interim, but I've been quite impressed with the way Liz Truss has handled the protocol. I'm not sure how much she has been overruled on things and how much she's doing it for, and she's not a dedicated leaver either, but maybe that doesn't matter. No, I can't come up with anyone inside the cabinet at the moment who I would really feel could turn things round for the Conservatives in time for the next general election and keep the red wall seats, which is crucial.
Well, you heard it here from Baroness Hoey. Thank you very much, Kate. Neither Sajid Javid nor Rishi Sunak are going to be Prime Minister. We'll see how that prediction holds up. If you're just joining us, if you've been in a cave for most of the day, two cabinet ministers resigned today in the last few hours. The Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Secretary of State for Health. Both have gone within minutes of each other. It's almost as if one resigned and the other thought, oh, well, I don't want to look as if I'm lingering too long, because come a future leadership race, the point at which you bailed on Boris is going to become important. Darren McCaffrey is back from across the river and with us now. I got to ask you the question that I ask everybody: is this the end of Boris, or will Houdini manage to get out of the straitjacket and avoid being lowered into the concrete overcoat at the bottom of the Thames?
I think in one answer, yes, or one word I should say, yes. I think it is the end. The question is, how long will the end take? But I think it is the end. Why do I say that? I think we've now had 7 resignations tonight, 2 cabinet ministers, a trade envoy, the vice chair of the party, 3 PPSs, and they are coming in. More interestingly as well, Mark, we've had, I mean, dozens, I think, possibly now of MPs, again, publicly stating they have started to submit letters of confidence in Boris's leadership. So I think there's a sense, there was 2 ways this could go tonight. Either we'd have essentially the cabinet almost en masse resigning. Now, that does not seem to have happened. We've had, of course, the Chancellor and the Health Secretary, 2 big departments. Nadeem Zahawi, of course, the Education Secretary, has just literally in the last minute or so gone into Downing Street. Lots of suggestions that he might be the new Chancellor, which would be a massive step up for him. But I think determined tonight, the government, to try and fill those positions. The problem is now with the wider party. And there are these elections, we know, to the 1922 committee next week. That's the governing party of the Conservative Party. Will they change the rules? Almost certainly. And if they do, are there now enough people who would submit a confidence vote that we would just have a vote potentially almost immediately? Yes. Would the Prime Minister then survive that? You know what? At the moment, that seems pretty unlikely, I would have thought.
Isn't there a slight problem, though, in that while there may be growing agreement that they don't want him, the party isn't sure what it does want and is likely to wind up with, you know, some peripheral junior cabinet minister who emerges as at the top of a crowded field but doesn't mean anything in the country?
Yeah, indeed. And this has always been, actually, in many ways, the Prime Minister's greatest strength. I mean, this is not like Theresa May, in which there was a very obvious successor, a very well-known successor in Boris Johnson, who is a great campaigner. Frankly, when you look at the alternatives, and, you know, his supporters would say this, and there's a massive element of truth in it. Like, frankly, first of all, half the country don't know who they are. They don't really know who Nadeem Zahawi is. They don't know who, certainly, Tom Tugendhat is. They don't really know who Ben Wallace is. Many of them still really don't know who Liz Truss is. Rishi Sunak, by the way, I have to say, in terms of the betting odds, has gone back up now to being the top likely person to succeed him. But will the party unite behind Rishi Sunak? I'm not entirely sure. Would the kind of Brexiteers be happy with that? Would they be happy with Liz Truss? And you're right, the problem is, for those that want to unseat the Prime Minister, is there is no one to kind of unite behind. Penny Mordaunt gets talked about, but again, Penny Mordaunt is not a national public figure on the same scale as many other senior politicians. But in saying that, the sense today is, and this is why it's all exploded, is that so many MPs are just fed up. They are fed up with essentially either having to defend the Prime Minister and then later for him to apologise for making mistakes or for forgetting things or for not necessarily telling the truth, or they just do not see this coming to an end, and so they want to move on.
The question is, what do you get for putting up with it? If you, it's one thing to have a Prime Minister who genuflects to his left too much, so you put up with net zero, you put up with some of this woke stuff that he likes to do. Or there's a thing to say, well, we put up with all his personal foibles, but he's delivered for us on this. And we've got the highest tax burden in 70 years. You know, there's not actually a lot to look. I mean, that's what I can't get over. That I don't know what he did when he wasn't joking around. When he wasn't joking around about cake, he wasn't joking around about some guy groping people in the Carlton Club. You can't be doing cake and Carlton Club groping all the time. There has to be something you do in between that makes people put up with the groping in the cave.
And this is the big problem, is that Boris Johnson over the last year has talked about a high wage economy, at the same time as calling for people to have restraint in terms of the wage increases because of inflation. He's talked about wanting to cut taxes desperately. He said it again tonight, by the way, in Parliament, talking to 80 MPs, but you're right, we've got the highest tax burden in 80 years. And there is, again, this thing, there is no... What is Johnsonism? We know what Thatcherism is. We know what Blairism is. What is Johnsonism? He's never been able really to articulate that beyond essentially levying it up, which is quite intangible anyway. And you're right, he's kind of held a kind of coalition together to a degree, but there's no real depth to it. And I think we've always talked, haven't we, about how the Conservative Party's had this transactional relationship with Boris Johnson, that essentially he became leader because they were desperate, they wanted to win the election or they wanted to get Brexit done. And there is a sense that that transaction is now not working because he's a political liability, he's dragging on the Conservative vote. Frankly, lots of MPs think they will lose their seats if he remains as leader, and that is why they've moved against him, as well as the kind of principal arguments some would argue about leadership and ethics inside Number 10. In saying that, you know, he is determined to stay on. He's clearly, you know, he is not going to resign. I think, I mean, you know, if he's going to survive this, he'll possibly survive anything. But I just think in the party now, and it's fascinating, look at the benches in the Commons when he stands up and makes statements. Same on Monday, how empty the Conservative benches are. There's just no depth of support there. And I suspect, as I say, we could see things either move quite quickly in the next 24 hours. I mean, today no one thought this was going to happen. But if not, that the rules will be changed and he could face another immediate challenge.
You know, when he was at The Spectator, my view, and the view of a lot of other people at The Spectator, was that he was quite a lonely man. He didn't have a lot of buddies. And because we were just like no account, you know, columnists and all the rest of it, we sort of assumed it was because his real buddies were, he was buddying up to more powerful and influential people. But in fact, he's been exactly the same in Parliament as he was at the Specky. He didn't actually have any buddies.
No, true. And in some ways there's actually a parallel there with Theresa May, as in they were not someone who kind of worked the tea rooms and the drinks receptions that much of trying to get people on board. And I think that builds into his character, that while he's, you know, clearly a very charismatic character and someone who's very good in some ways at kind of small talk, that actually he's not someone who likes to build up kind of solid political relationships in terms of kind of putting in the hours of trying to win people around and having a cabal. You know, David Cameron was, whatever you think about him, was very good at kind of building up the Notting Hill set of kind of a group
of
the
Chipping Norton set. I mean, he had like sets everywhere.
And Boris doesn't have that. And again, you're right in the sense that, you know, that's a problem. And another problem is doesn't, you know, for his supporters would say he's very loyal. He doesn't like to let people down, but he also makes lots of people lots of promises that he's not necessarily been able to keep. And the other thing, of course, with kind of cabinet reshuffles, which he's not going to have to do, and resignations and stuff, is that the backbenches just continue to fill up with opponents. And that means the position of governing just becomes so much more difficult. And all I would say finally on this is the crisp, you know, the whole kind of deputy whip affair. What it's showing is, because this didn't start out about Boris Johnson. No. But every story now, every negative story within the Conservative Party will go back to the Prime Minister. It will be used by his opponents to beat him with a stick. And when you're in that position, it just becomes relentless. Relentless. And we're 2 years out from an election.
But it's also about the change in the Tory party that has happened in recent years. We'll let you get back to Westminster. I'm not sure we're done yet with developments for this night.
We're not.
So we will see. There's a lot of coming and going at Number 10. There are cabinet ministers who are going in there, and it's very reminiscent of Mrs. Thatcher taking soundings in 1990.
The really interesting difference in all of this, though, is that all kind of in some ways happened behind closed doors. The men in the grey suits. This is all very public.
That's very true. Thank you, Darren. A great and lively night. And as I said to Darren, I don't think we're done yet. The Tory party, you know, I can't believe, if this is true, that the final straw that broke the Tory camel's back is a deputy whip groping bottoms of various male persons in the Carlton Club. I happen to be at the Carlton Club, and it's a sad place in many ways, because you see the spectacular portraits, floor-to-ceiling portraits of the Duke of Wellington and then the Marquis of Salisbury. All the great Tory leaders are there. The great floor-to-ceiling portraits, Duke of Wellington, Marquis of Salisbury, and they literally get smaller as you go up to the... So there's like this, there's one like this of the Marquis of Salisbury at the foot of that spectacular staircase, and then right next to it there's a tiny little one of oil painting of David Cameron, which is a bigger oil painting than that guy deserves. But like, they're literal pygmies next to the giants of the Tory party, like Lord Salisbury and the Duke of Wellington. What do you think? Ian says, it's up to us, the public. We are not interested in cakes or curtains. We voted for Boris. Jeff says, Claudia Webb for next PM. Roger says, talking of congenital liars, has Starmer resigned it? Look, what you have to understand, Roger, is the great British media, they're fascinated by whatever bottoms the deputy chief whip of the Conservative Party gropes, if they can take that hand from the deputy chief whip and lay it on Boris himself. They have no interest in Keir Starmer. The so-called fixed penalty notice in Durham is of absolutely no interest to them. It's the dog that didn't bark. The silence of the media on the Durham police and Keir Starmer. But Keir Starmer has the advantage. He's just the opposition leader, and all he has to do is just, after the chaos, in a time of chaos, it's like Joe Biden. Joe Biden supposedly won, if you believe the official figures, by staying in his basement and occasionally doing a rally in which there would be 7 people present. And that was it. And he supposedly beat Trump with that because he was dull and boring and Trump was too lively. And something of the same trajectory seems to be emerging here. Tina says, I'm sick of the mainstream media telling us what we think. I voted for Boris Johnson and fully support him. I'm fed up of the witch hunt in the media that has been happening. Donald says, Boris must stay. It is the end of democracy in this country if the media are going to dictate who they want to run the country. We're in very dangerous waters. Boris has to stay. You know, we get a lot of mail like that, but it would be, you know, in the end, what has Boris Johnson done with his 3 years as Prime Minister? As I said, I think this is a person. I remember 30 years ago, I think I've mentioned this on air before, but it's 30 years, almost exactly 30 years ago. There was a lunch at the Spectator. Boris Johnson arrived late. He burst into the room and he said, I just had the most amazing dream. I woke up and suddenly realized I was going to be Prime Minister. And we all burst out laughing because he had that faintly vulgar, unseemly, too obvious ambition that the British are said not to care for. And so we all thought it was a crashing joke. And then he made it happen. And what did he do with his victory? That's the tragedy, that he's Theresa May, he's who was the guy before Theresa May and who was the guy before that? The tiny portrait on the Carlton Club staircase. Laura Perrins from the Conservative Woman is here. Laura, you kind of had Boris's character flaws down years before he became Prime Minister.
Yes, good evening, Mark. I mean, I can understand why this is a difficult one for sort of Conservative voters or small c Conservative voters, those to the right of the party, because rightly they're thinking, you know, why now? Why the big push now? Rightly they're probably thinking those who want him out and talk about integrity don't really care about what he did or didn't know about, you know, Mr. Pincher in the Carlton Club, that there's something else going on here. But as you've already said, the problem for those on the right of the party is that other than Brexit, Johnson in power have not been conservative at all. I mean, what has he given us? He's given us a ruinous lockdown that has partly caused a crushing cost of lockdown or cost of living crisis. He's given us net zero, which has also contributed to this devastating cost of living crisis. Over the weekend, he was talking about let's have more, gender identity clinics, and he hasn't got a handle on immigration at all. Both legal and illegal immigration continues at levels that I don't think the electorate has given consent for. So if you go into the shires, the Tory voting shires, are these things that they have voted for? Do they say, yes, I would like more gender identity clinics, I definitely want more immigration, I can't wait for net zero, and I'm really pleased that my diesel and petrol is through the roof? I mean, I don't think any of those things are vote winners.
Well, we've just heard that Steve Barclay is going to replace Sajid Javid as the Health Secretary. I mean, this is the thing with cabinet resignations. 20 minutes later, it's as if they were never there. The problem, I guess, when you put it the way you do, Laura, is there was this great personality. I made the Trump comparison. Trump was not a conservative. He was nobody's idea of a conservative. He'd had a rather disreputable life, although not as disreputable as the Prime Minister's. All his ex-wives seem to speak quite well of him, and he seems to have been very civilized about the whole thing. But the base felt that they understood the deal. They'd go along with Trump, and in return, Trump would do certain things, which he did. So the Tories try to strike the same deal, and at Boris Johnson's end, he doesn't honour it.
Yeah, I think that might have worked in the US because the actual party, the Republican Party, have kept Trump in line or pointed him in the right direction. I mean, his judicial appointments are obviously his main legacy, and it was Mitch McConnell essentially who solidified those. Yes, Trump chose all the judges, so he was held. A huge amount of work went into getting those judges through from other people that had nothing to do with Trump. I mean, apart from the fact that we don't have any conservative policies, I mean, I think his complete lack of integrity is an issue. And I was always, years and years ago, people can read a piece I did from 2014. I was always, I always hated it when people said, oh, his personal life is his personal life. That's nothing to do with his politics or his policy. And you're like, no, it's incredibly difficult to separate people out like that, because his lack of discipline is obviously there in his personal life, and that has spilled over into his professional life, which is why we're in the mess that we are in now. I mean, unfortunately, he does lie, and if he lies in his personal life, he will tell huge, great, massive lies in his public life. And instead of, screwing all over your wives, it's the entire country now that gets screwed over. So it's difficult to separate the two.
There is something to be said. He has left an awful lot of human wreckage in his wake, and I'm not talking about his various wives whom I don't know, but just rather less famous ladies that he made promises to and didn't honour. And in the end, those things can tell. The question here now is: are we basically just in for a decade of Labour rule? Keir is trying to be sufficiently boring that he will win by default because he doesn't frighten anyone the way Jeremy Corbyn did.
Well, I mean, I don't think Keir Starmer as Prime Minister would be a complete disaster. I mean, let's be honest. It's not like you have Corbyn there, which I think is part of the reason why Boris got in, right? Because nobody with any sense of dignity or sort of respect for the country could possibly put Corbyn in as Prime Minister. But Keir Starmer is there, and he obviously is the anti-Boris in terms of he's incredibly dull. And as long as he can't make any howlers, you would imagine that he probably, it would be difficult to see how he couldn't win the next election, because the Tories will be in such disarray. The public will be so angry with all the navel gazing, even if they're not into the details. They get angry with the navel gazing, which will continue now for the next 6 months at least. And they will just say, well, we might as well try the other guys, because I can't drive to work now anymore because he decided to go with net zero and prolong the war.
Yeah, no, back in the real world, if you look at the price of petrol, if you look at the price of food, those are not boutique issues. Those are things that resonate on every corner of the kingdom, and the fact that he's having this big drama, the psychodrama at the time of real pain for real people, maybe what does for him above anything else. Thank you very much, Laura Perrins. You did have his number. We are continuing live from Westminster, where 2 cabinet ministers have resigned. There are other resignations too, and Dan Wootton is here and is gonna. Dan, you've been rather loyaler to Boris than most people, and are you stunned by these developments, or do you think this is just today's crisis and tomorrow something else?
Well, I'm stunned by the selfishness of these resignations. You know, middle of a cost of living crisis, middle of a health crisis, and I've put career before country, in my view, Mark. Maybe a minority opinion, certainly amongst the political establishment, but that's how I feel. So we're going to have all of the breaking developments, Mark, over the next 2 hours. Brilliant show tonight, by the way. No spin, no bias, no censorship. I'm Dan Wootton, and breaking tonight. After the shock resignations of Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid, 2 of his most senior cabinet ministers, following his apology for promoting Chris Pincher.
Yes, I think it was a mistake, and I apologise for it. I think in hindsight it was the wrong thing to do.
Can Boris Johnson turn this